The rain in Lisbon fell the way grief falls, not all at once, but in quiet, persistent increments that soaked through everything without announcing itself. Orion Vex was at his drafting table when the postman slid the small square envelope under the studio door. He almost did not look up. He had been reconstructing the ground floor plans of a harbourside library for 3 weeks, his pencil moving in the mechanical rhythms that had replaced conversation, replaced appetite, replaced most of the texture of living since Luma left. She had gone to the Maldives 4 months ago. The marine research grant had arrived like an answered prayer at the exact wrong moment, their marriage starving quietly in the space between his late project silences and her need to be near the ocean that had raised her. They were not broken, she had said. They were only tired. She would be back before them and soon. Orion tore open the envelope. A Polaroid slid into his palm, Luma, standing waist-deep in luminous lagoon water, her white sundress clinging to a gently swollen belly, her face turned toward the camera with an expression he had not seen in 2 years, that unguarded, full-throated joy she used to wear in the early days of their marriage, when everything still felt like discovery. On the back, in her looping handwriting, "Something grew while you were sleeping." He sat with it for a very long time. The pencil fell from his hand. Outside, the rain found a gap in the window and dripped onto the harbour blueprints, spreading a slow blue stain across the paper like a bruise blooming in slow motion. Orion pressed the Polaroid against his sternum and stared at the ceiling until the light bulb above him became a blur. They had not been intimate since the miscarriage. 14 months of careful distance, of 2 bodies lying close in the dark and not reaching. He had wanted to. God, he had wanted to. But every time he turned toward her in the night, he felt the weight of everything they had buried, and his hands would stay at his sides like obedient dogs. He had assumed, foolishly, terribly, that she felt the same. He called Dahlia that evening. His sister answered on the second ring, voice warm with leftover dinner noise. "She's pregnant," he said. A long pause. Orion. 4 months. Dahlia. For months on an island and now this. His voice was very steady, the way very cold water is very still. "I'm going to go see her." "Call her first. Please. Just." But he had already ended the call. He opened his laptop and searched for flights to Mail Atoll. His hands did not shake. That frightened him more than anything else, the absolute, terrible calm of a man who had already decided to disappear. He told himself he was only going for closure. One last look. Proof. Then he would go somewhere quiet and let the whole thing dissolve. He would leave her the apartment, the savings, the good years. He would leave her everything except his broken presence. What Orion did not know, what he could not possibly know as he folded 3 shirts into a carry-on bag and set his drafting table in careful order, was that Luma had been keeping a secret not of betrayal but of extraordinary, terrified love, a love so fragile she had wrapped it in silence to protect it from the weight of his hope. He boarded the plane in the early hours, his chest an architectural ruin, carrying the Polaroid in his breast pocket like a wound he had not yet learned the shape of. The color of salt and longing. Thilamafushi in early October wore its beauty indifferently, the way a beautiful person wears their face. The water was the color of a held breath, shallow, transparent turquoise over white sand, deepening to cobalt at the reef's edge where the ocean floor simply vanished. Orion arrived by seaplane, watching the island materialize below him like a brushstroke on silk, and felt nothing except the old familiar sickness of wanting something he believed he no longer had the right to want. He rented a small guest house on the northern tip from a woman named Inez Coral, who wore her silver hair in a crown braid and assessed strangers with the frank, unhurried gaze of someone who had lived beside the sea long enough to read weather in a face. She gave him a room with a ceiling fan and a view of the lagoon. She brought him a clay cup of black tea without being asked. "You look lost," she said, without unkindness. "I know exactly where I am." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "That's the problem." From the guesthouse terrace he could see Luma's research camp further down the shore, 2 white canvas tents, a rack of dive equipment drying in the sun, a motorboat nudged against a short wooden jetty. He watched through the screen of palm fronds. He watched her the way a man watches a tide chart, cataloguing rhythms, looking for the moment when it would be safe to approach and finding, every time, that no such moment existed. She was more beautiful than he remembered, which was not a surprise but still hit him like a physical force somewhere behind the ribs. She moved through the shallow water with the unhurried authority of someone who had made peace with her body in a way she never had on land, wading to her knees with a sample kit, bending to the waterline so her braids skimmed the surface, laughing at something Professor Riel said across the water. And when she straightened and pressed one hand to the curve of her belly with her eyes half closed and her face tilted toward the sun, Orion gripped the terrace railing with both hands and turned away because he was not sure he could survive the tenderness of watching her love something that wasn't his. He nearly booked his return flight that afternoon. He sat on the guesthouse bed with his phone in his hand for 40 minutes. Inez appeared in the doorway with a plate of sliced mango and the expression of someone who had been quietly watching his internal weather. "What are you afraid to find?" she asked, sitting on the low chair across from him with the ease of someone fully at home everywhere. Orion told her everything. The miscarriage. The silence that grew in its wake. The Polaroid. The conviction that had calcified in his chest over 20 sleepless hours of travel. Inez listened without once attempting to fix him, which he would later recognize as the greatest kindness. "The ocean," she said eventually, "returns everything it takes. But only when you stop standing at the edge demanding it back on your schedule." That night the bioluminescent plankton bloomed in the lagoon. Orion walked to the shore barefoot at midnight and stood in the shallows while every ripple his feet made fractured into cold blue light, a world glowing just beneath the surface he had always been too afraid to enter. He stayed until the stars wheeled overhead and the camp down the shore went dark, and then he stayed an hour longer, listening to the tide come in. Luma had noticed him on the second day. She had excellent peripheral vision, a useful inheritance from years spent watching for reef sharks in her blind spots, and the silhouette on the northern ridge was not local. She recognized the particular way he stood, weight slightly on the left foot, shoulders drawn inward, as if perpetually braced for something heavy to arrive. She had memorized that posture across 6 years of standing beside him. She gave him one more day before she went to find him. The confrontation happened at the waterline, in the blue hour before dawn, when the sky was the color of old silver and the lagoon held perfectly still. She came around the headland in her waterproof sandals and her research vest and stopped 3 meters from him, and they regarded each other across the narrow strip of wet sand with the careful attention of two people who have forgotten how not to love each other. "How long?" she said. 3 days. He did not apologize for the surveillance. Neither did she demand one. "You thought it was someone else, it was not a question." He looked at the water. "Luma." "Orion." Her voice broke on the second syllable and then steadied. "Look at me." He did. She pulled a small waterproof camera from her vest pocket and held it out between them. Her hand was trembling. "Watch all of it," she said. "Please." He stood in the shallows with the camera in his hands and watched 12 video entries, each one a month old. He watched Luma in a clinic corridor, pressing both hands over her mouth to contain something enormous. He watched her say, voice barely a whisper, "Orion, I know you're not watching this yet, but it worked. The embryo attached. I didn't tell you because I've lost this before and I could not survive losing it again under the weight of our combined hope. So I came here to let the ocean hold what I could not ask you to hold yet. I'm not keeping a secret. I'm keeping a promise." In a later video she was in the lagoon at sunset, hand on her belly, saying his name softly into the camera the way she used to say it in the dark of their bedroom when she thought he was asleep. Orion's knees buckled. He sat down in the shallow water, fully clothed, the ocean soaking through his shirt, and pressed the camera to his forehead and wept with such complete abandon that the sound of it scattered the herons from the nearby mangroves. Luma waded in and sat beside him. The water rose to their hips. She took the camera from his hands and set it on the dry sand beyond the tide line, and then she took both his hands in hers and held them open, palm upward, on top of her belly. They stayed like that for a long time, the ocean moving around them, the light growing slowly from silver to rose to gold. There was nothing elegant about it, his wet clothes, her practical research vest, the herons returning one by one to the mangroves as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But when he felt the soft insistent pressure of a small kick against his palm, something in Orion that had been quietly dying for 14 months simply opened back up, the way a window opens in a house that has been shut all winter. "Her name," Luma said softly, watching his face. "You already know." A smile. "I've known since the 2nd month." She leaned her head against his shoulder, finally. "Do you want to hear it?" "Not yet," he said. "I want to earn it first." The language of the deep. Professor Thomas Riel was a small, wiry Maldivian academic of 62 with sun-cured skin and the habit of narrating his own observations aloud regardless of audience. He took one look at Orion sitting at the research camp table the morning after the reunion, hollow-eyed and wrung out and entirely unable to stop glancing at Luma, and announced to no one in particular that he believed the coral transect on the east side of the reef required his personal attention for approximately 72 hours. He took the motorboat, a notebook, and a thermos of tea, and did not return. Inez sent coconut wine and oil lanterns without commentary. Those 3 days existed outside the normal measure of time. Orion helped Luma with her morning water samples, learning the weight and rhythm of the sample bottles, the way she labeled each one with the exactitude she had always brought to things she loved. She taught him to read the reef's color as a health indicator, the pale bleached sections telling their quiet story of warming water, the vivid purple and orange stretches where the coral was still thriving. He began to understand that she had come here not merely to study the ocean but to be repaired by it, the same way the reef repaired itself, slowly, incrementally, cell by cell. On the second afternoon they took the research kayak to a shallow, sheltered reef pool and slid into the water together. The pool was no deeper than their chests and warm as breath. Luma showed him how to keep his face in the water and breathe slowly through the snorkel until the fish forgot he was there. They drifted side by side in a companionable silence, watching a pair of butterfly fish negotiate the coral architecture with the meticulous confidence of creatures entirely at home. Then Luma reached underwater and took his hand and guided it to the side of her belly. Beneath the surface the sound of the ocean was a low, planetary hum, and against his palm he felt a flutter of movement, small, definite, full of intent. He lifted his face from the water and looked at Luma, and she was already watching him, mask pushed up, the sun in her wet lashes, her expression open in a way he had not seen since their first year together when everything was still new and terrifying in the best possible way. He kissed her then, a salt-slow kiss that tasted of the ocean and arrived like something that had been traveling a very long way to get there. At night they lay on the research boat's bow under a sky thick with stars, listening to hydrophone recordings of whale song that Luma had collected the previous month. The sound traveled through the boat's hull and into their spines, that enormous, mournful, impossibly beautiful frequency that whales used to speak across distances no human voice could bridge. "That's what it was like without you," Luma said quietly. "Like trying to hear something very important across too much water." Orion turned his head toward her in the dark. "I didn't know you needed me to come closer. I thought, after we lost her, that giving you space was the same as giving you room to breathe." "I know." Her hand found his in the dark. "I was doing the same thing. We were both making room and the room just kept growing." He turned onto his side and brought her face between his hands with the particular gentleness of a person handling something irreplaceable. In the blue-white starlight her eyes were dark and open and entirely unguarded. "No more room," he said against her forehead. "No more distance. Even when I'm afraid." She pressed herself against him and he wrapped around her carefully, one hand resting on the warmth of her belly, and they lay entangled on the rocking boat while the whale song moved through them like deep water, and the stars completed their slow rotation overhead, and somewhere below them the coral quietly went on building its intricate, patient architecture out of nothing but time and salt and the persistent desire to grow. On the third morning they talked about the apartment in Lisbon. About the room on the second floor they had emptied after the miscarriage and never refurnished. Orion pulled out the small worn notebook he always carried and began sketching, not the room as it was but the room as it might become, the ocean floor rendered in soft blues and whites across the longest wall, the crib positioned where it would catch the morning light, the window seat where Luma could sit to nurse in the small hours and watch the harbor shimmer. She leaned over his shoulder and watched him draw, her chin resting on his shoulder, her braid falling across his arm. "You're going to paint all of that." "I'm going to build all of that," he said. On their last night on Thilamafushi the bioluminescence returned to the lagoon with an intensity that Inez said she had not seen in 3 years, the plankton so dense that the water from shoreline to reef edge glowed a continuous, trembling blue, as if the ocean had turned itself inside out and the stars were now beneath them rather than above. They waded in together in the hour after midnight, when the camp was dark and the island's few other guests were sleeping. The water was warm and shallow, reaching Luma's thighs, swirling with cold luminescence around every movement. Where Orion's hand skimmed the surface, it left a trail of blue sparks. Where Luma moved, a constellation shifted. They stood facing each other in the blue-lit water. Orion took her hands in both of his and held them the way you hold something you are not going to put down again. The glow rose and fell with the gentle wave action, illuminating her face in slow pulses. Her cheekbones, the curve of her throat, the dark architecture of her eyes watching him with an attention that made him feel both very seen and very safe. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I never had a speech. You know I'm better with blueprints." She laughed, a soft sound that dissolved into the ocean noise. "Then draw something." He lowered one hand to the water's surface and wrote her name in light, Luma, watching the bioluminescence flare gold blue along each stroke. "That's my vow," he said. "I will keep writing your name in whatever light I can find. Even when I'm afraid. Especially when I'm afraid." Luma pressed his hand back to her belly. "We made this together," she said. "On that last night before I left. Do you remember? You fell asleep on the sofa and I came and lay beside you and," her voice went quiet and certain, "I think she decided to stay that night. Because we were both finally still enough for her to find us." He pulled her in slowly, carefully, the warm water rising between them, her belly a gentle, warm pressure against him, her forehead against his jaw. They stood like that while the ocean moved around them and the sky showed its whole astronomy overhead, and the light that the tide makes when it is full of living things glowed and glowed without needing anyone's permission. "Her name," he said, finally. "I'm ready." Luma tilted her head back and looked at him. "Maria," she said. "It means tide in Portuguese. And in Spanish it means the sea that returns," he said softly. "Yes." They flew home to Lisbon the following morning with Luma's field journals, a small jar of lagoon sand, and the waterproof camera's video files backed up on every device they owned. Professor Riel met them at the jetty with the motorboat and shook Orion's hand with both of his own and said absolutely nothing, which Orion understood was the highest form of approval the man possessed. Inez stood on the guesthouse terrace and raised her clay cup of tea in their direction as the seaplane lifted off the water and banked west toward the open ocean. In Lisbon 3 weeks later, Orion repainted the second-floor room. Luma lay on the daybed in the corner and directed him. The coral formations in the lower left, the bioluminescent bloom across the ceiling, the whale silhouette barely visible in the deep blue of the far wall. He worked for 9 days straight. On the 10th morning he found Luma asleep on the sofa downstairs with her hand on her belly, the Polaroid and the first ultrasound image sitting side by side in a single frame on the shelf above her head, the light coming in off the harbor making everything in the room warm and temporary and entirely sufficient. He did not wake her. He sat on the floor beside the sofa and took her free hand and held it while the harbor traffic moved outside and the city went on being a city, indifferent to the particular miracle of two people who had nearly lost each other to silence finding their way back through salt and light and the courage to stop making so much room for fear. Maria was born on a February morning when the harbor was flat and silver and the seagulls were very loud. She arrived, as Luma had always known she would, precisely on her own schedule, into the careful architecture of hands that had waited a very long time to hold her, in a room that smelled of new paint and the ocean they had carried home in a small glass jar.